This is one of the most important maps in U.S. and Mexican history. It's the map used to negotiate the border between the two countries to end the Mexican-American War in 1848. Including Texas, it transferred over half of Mexico's land to the U.S. But it wasn't a clean-cut deal. The map had some serious errors, and the U.S. quickly wanted more land, nearly bringing the two countries back to war. Let's take a closer look. Rivers are misplaced, some river branches simply don't exist, the topography is merely a basic undeveloped sketch, and towns are inaccurately positioned. The treaty that ended the Mexican-American War, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, stated the new U.S.-Mexico border ran westwardly along the whole southern boundary of New Mexico, which runs north of the town of Paso, to its western termination. But on the map, Paso, or El Paso, is positioned around 40 miles further north and 100 miles further east of its true location. The boundary of New Mexico also isn't well defined, but it's roughly drawn at about 32 degrees north. These inaccuracies and ambiguities would soon become problematic. The map was first published in 1846 by New York publisher John Disternell, but it was a copy of older maps. Let's go to raremaps.com, a website that acts as an old map encyclopedia, though it's technically an antique map shop. Disternell used the plates from this 1828 map by New York publishing firm White Gallagher & White. This map is essentially a copy of this 1825, a map of the United States of Mexico by Henry Schenck Tanner. As a result, the errors on the maps were repeated over and over and over. These errors were noticed the next year by a joint survey commission, but it was too late. The treaty was ratified by both governments, and those that already had American citizenship prior to the treaty were moving into what was now disputed territory. John Disternell issued this map to correct the earlier errors and to illustrate the disputed boundary lines. The U.S. claim is in red and Mexico's blue. In 1853, Mexican authorities began evicting American settlers from the disputed territory. Unhappy with the U.S. federal government's lack of response, New Mexico Governor William Lane asserted that the Mesilla Valley was part of the U.S. territory of New Mexico. In retaliation, Mexican President Antonio de Santa Anna dispatched military forces to enforce Mexico's claims. Worried that another conflict with Mexico was nearing, U.S. President Franklin Pierce dispatched the newly appointed U.S. Minister to Mexico, James Gadsden, for negotiations with Santa Anna. Gadsden was directed to work on redrawing the border to facilitate a southern railroad, but as it turned out, even if Mexico relinquished its claims, the best route for building a railroad would go into Mexico's territory, so he would need to ask for even more. Government leaders, business interests, and the American public were actively engaged in the pursuit of building a transcontinental railroad, recognizing its immense potential for promoting national unity and economic development and facilitating Western expansion. The United States had earlier attempted to build a train through another part of Mexico. Mid-war, the U.S. government attempted to purchase the Isthmus of Tehuantepec in order to build a southern connection between the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. However, Mexico had already authorized a Mexican citizen to build a railway in the region. But in 1850, U.S. investors purchased his concession. The Mexican government was never comfortable with the U.S. presence, and the project slowly deteriorated. U.S. investors lost an estimated $140 million, adjusted to today's value. The discovery of gold in California in 1848 sparked a massive influx of thousands seeking their fortunes, as people from various regions flocked to the territory with aspirations of striking it rich. But as Disternell displayed in this 1851 map, it was better for many to head overland through a foreign country than to head straight through the contiguous U.S. If the United States wanted to be connected, it needed railways. Southerners were especially interested in a southern transcontinental railway. Tensions between the North and South were escalating in the mid-19th century, and so Southerners preferred a transcontinental route through the South to avoid dependence on the Northern-controlled rail lines, and to promote their own economic development and interests independent of the North. The finding of gold only increased this desire. Pierce was also aware that France was attempting to purchase Sonora, so the U.S. needed to act fast. Gadsden was told to propose 6 options, ranging in size and price. $50 million would have bought the Baja California Peninsula and a large portion of the northwestern Mexican states, while $15 million was to buy the 38,000 square miles of desert necessary for the railroad plans. These prices included the coverage of all damages caused by cross-border attacks by Indians against Mexicans and relieved the U.S. of their future obligations to protect Mexicans. This obligation had been included in the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, but the United States had found it to be an impossible task and wanted out of the deal. Santa Anna needed money for an army to put down rebellions, but also to defend against the U.S. Less than 2 weeks after Gadsden first met with the president, a U.S. physician and lawyer named William Walker marched into Mexico with 45 men and claimed the Baja Peninsula, and soon after the entirety of Sonora, and declared himself president. However, the Mexican president didn't want to give up large portions of land, so he accepted the $15 million. But the deal didn't get the required 2/3 approval in the U.S. Senate. Some changes were made, which included lowering the offer to $10 million for less land, as some senators were against giving Santa Anna so much money. Santa Anna agreed to the changes, and the treaty went into effect on June 30th, 1854. Most policymakers at the time thought the United States would eventually expand further into Mexico, but this piece of land became the last land addition to the contiguous U.S. The American Civil War broke out in 1861, which delayed the construction of the Southern Transcontinental Route, just as it did for other major railroad projects. The Southern Pacific Railroad reached Tucson in 1880 and completed its line to New Orleans in 1883, effectively creating a Southern Transcontinental route. In closing, I believe the Disternal map stands as a testament to the complexities and challenges of 19th century mapping of North America, while simultaneously serving as an example of how maps are not just tools for navigation, but are instruments that can guide the course of nations and their histories. Before I end this video, I want to mention a couple of other things related that I just couldn't find a place to slip in without disrupting the story. First, the 1846 edition of the Disternal map is also the first map to name both the city of Miami, Florida, and Atlanta, Georgia. And second, Pedro Garcia Conde, the lead surveyor for Mexico on the Boundary Commission, published this 1845 map, but he had to hide it from the government because by the time he finished the manuscript, the government said that they didn't have the funding, but he still wasn't allowed to publish it privately. It wasn't until 2007 that Mexican scholars knew of the first edition. I learned this information from today's sponsor, raremaps.com. As you saw earlier in the video, they're a great website for just searching and learning about old maps, but they're actually an online antique map shop with over 10,000 maps available for purchase. This currently includes the map this video was about, as well as the White, Gallagher, and White map the Disternal copied. But if these are a bit over budget, they have maps for as low as $125, going back as far as the year 1550. Again, that's raremaps.com. And that's all for this video. Thank you to all my Patreon and YouTube members for supporting the channel, and thank you all for watching.